As we make a transition, a government like the UAE is prepared for the transition and investing in renewables. Saudi Arabia is going long on solar, long on green hydrogen. But I'm worried about states that sit on vast hydrocarbon assets, not realize the benefits over in the last 50 years probably as efficiently as they could. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Algeria, Nigeria, there's a long list there. I'm quite worried about these states who are not prepared for the energy transition or climate change. And you could have failed states in a matter of 10 or 15 years as a result. I know you've given it some thought, but should it be a risk that we're calculating today? Do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, I think it's a risk that comes. It may not come as quickly as a lot of people would like. The energy transition has been slower. I think fossil fuels will be a little bit more enduring than a lot of activists would like. That being said, any country that's not making that transition now faces not only a shock in the future, but a shock that could create more domestic turmoil. So countries that already have domestic turmoil, if suddenly they're no longer able to sustain their level of finance, will create even more turmoil. The other thing to watch very interestingly is how do the geopolitics, and I'll just make this a couple of sentences so we can get on. But there's sort of geopolitics of the energy transition. There's certainly been geopolitics around oil and gas for years and years and years. But there are also going to be geopolitics around clean technology and about supply chains and about who controls those supply chains. I think it will be more evenly distributed, but we haven't really looked at that closely. And right now, obviously, China controls a lot of the critical minerals in the supply chains that have to do with that.
Good. Your Excellency, Luigi Di Maio, you were foreign minister for Italy and now the special representative for the European Union to the Gulf region. And the ties, I would suggest, have deepened in the Gulf because of its energy security prowess here, both oil and gas, and its diversification. What are the priorities when it comes to the energy portfolio are you working on for the European Union to maintain that open channel for energy into Europe, which had a heck of a shock because of Russia-Ukraine?
Yes, we created as European Union a new strategy for a strong partnership with the Gulf countries on 2022, when I was still the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as European member states, we created the so-called new strategy with the Gulf countries. And the point is that we have to work with the Gulf countries, in particular the GCC, not just when there are crises, where we are in troubles, but in order to create a strong partnership at the level that we deserve as strategic partners. This is the first point. About energy, it's not just about fossil fuels. Obviously, the countries of the region, they helped Europe after the Russian aggression against Ukraine, but they were always reliable suppliers of fossil fuels. But now the new opportunity for them and for Europe, so for the countries like the Emirates and for countries like the GCC countries, it's the new policy of Europe of European Union about Green Deal, Repower EU. We are going to import by 2030 10 million tons of hydrogen per year. And they are investing a lot in the hydrogen sector. We are going to quadruple the amount of raw materials in order to implement our Green Deal according to the new technologies, to the needs of the new technologies for renewables. And they are investing a lot, not only in their own capacity, but even in the African continent for partnerships about raw materials. So my opinion is that never than now, we have an enormous opportunity to work together about the new generation of partnerships, not only about the old idea that the GCC countries are suppliers of fossil fuels for Europe or for the West. Even because after that, US became an oil and gas exporter more than importer, it was clear that many countries of the GCC are looked at the Asia as main market for fossil fuels. Now the new challenge is to work about renewables with them. And this is a part of my mandate. We are late, obviously, as European Union, honestly. A lot of mistakes. As you know, there is a negotiation about the free trade agreement that started 33 years ago. There are officials in the DG Trade in Brussels that are younger than the negotiation of this free trade agreement. But I think that we have
your good self.
Yeah, but we have to fill this gap, and this is part of my mandate, and inshallah.
Good. It's interesting. We had Sebastian Kurz in the previous panel, and
we were colleagues.
A new generation of leaders, which inspires the other three of us that are sitting on the panels together. You brought up a very interesting point, and I'm going to circle back on strategic minerals. The Atlantic Council did a special study on this as well, so I think it's worth spending time on. But Bill, I think it'd be great to have you highlight this rallying call by the UAE government at COP to get this tripling of nuclear capacity on the table. Can it be cool again? I think I even posed that question when we were together, because a lot of people are saying in Germany they retrenched from nuclear, right? And there's still the fear factor, but there's a whole new generation of options today. It will be part of the solution, but can it be deployed at that sort of scale?
Well, that's going to be the real question, isn't it? And I think that the answer to that question depends on a much larger question about how serious are we really about solving the climate crisis. I heard your earlier question about if we can put a man on the moon, why can't we solve this problem? Well, we have to want to solve the problem. And it's one thing to say that we want to solve the problem. It's another to take the steps to show that we actually do. And if we really do want to drive to net zero by 2050, it's inevitable that nuclear will have a large role. There's no other way to get there in that time frame without a significant deployment of nuclear. So tripling might be conservative if that's accurate. But I think that for that to happen, there are issues that will have to be dealt with. They are all solvable issues. We had a ministerial meeting in Paris during September in which UAE participated, where we discussed at the leadership level what are the barriers, what are the obstacles, and they came down to some simple, well-understood areas. Finance is a big issue. Human capacity for many countries is a limiting factor, and as you already heard, supply chain. But these are all solvable if we really will put the resources, the attention, the leadership into resolving them. They can all be adjusted.
A very quick follow-up. I'm living in the UK for the fourth time, and I saw the facility built here in the southeastern part of the country at a pretty rapid pace, a little bit slowed down at the end to make sure the security was correct. But the Hinkley project in the UK is woefully behind schedule and very expensive. And I think it scares off people making big commitments. So how do we tackle? Does it have not to be big in the future, and you can do small reactors and medium-sized reactors to solve the problem?
You know, in my view, the size of the reactors is actually less important than the expertise, the supply chain, the experience you bring to the project. And if you look at the UAE project, which I think is universally seen as having been very successful, to me, the most important factor was the selection of a supplier that brought the knowledge, the experience, the supply chain to the project. There wasn't really the uncertainties you see with a lot of other projects around the world. In Western countries like UK, US, France, others, we have been building these plants in a long time. And you can't expect you can just simply turn on the industry today and say, okay, let's get this plant built on cost, on schedule. You're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to have issues. You can work your way through those issues, but those first projects are going to be very, very difficult, and that's what we're seeing.
Okay, thanks for the clarity on that. I want to go back to what Luigi Di Maio was bringing up, and that's strategic minerals. You're both very qualified to address this. We need 7 times the capacity, at least, of the mining capacity that we have today to have an energy transition for solar panels, for battery storage, for wind turbines, and the rest. And again, if you ask the average consumer, are you willing to see all this mining activity around the world? Doesn't sound very climate friendly. The answer would probably be no. And we're seeing pushback in Europe now to the consumer is seeing the fact that the transition will probably cost a lot of money for them. Chancellor Scholz is facing that challenge in Germany itself. How do you grasp this, Fred? Your team's put together a really good comprehensive study on the transition and demand, but this is a very steep curve, is it not? Then I'll ask Luigi Di Maio.
Look, one of the things that was most positive about COP28 was never at a COP has the private sector shown up in such great numbers, and you had some really practical solutions, and so it's great to embrace the rhetoric, as you were just saying, of climate change, but it's really the transition of the private sector that's going to make it real, whether it's the tripling of goals for nuclear energy. And with critical minerals and this new critical mineral partnership that's been set up, it's a good thing it's been set up. It's a good thing that governments are bringing this together. But the private sector then has to go out and do. A lot of people think that the minerals are in a very few countries, and the very few countries are very hard to get at, and that a lot of the minerals are tied up in Chinese acquisitions. The fact is there's just much more to be found, and there's much more out there, and it's much more evenly distributed than oil and gas is. So it could be a real democratizing thing, but it's going to take a lot of exploration, and it's going to take a lot of people willing to do, as you said, the mining that a lot of environmental activists would not. The same environmental activists that want to solve the climate crisis don't want the mining to be done to come up with the minerals to solve the crisis.
Yeah, it's very, very true. This raises that point of the super region that's trying to be led by Saudi Arabia. They've been hosting the Future Minerals Forum. They see the super region going, as you know, Luigi, from Central Asia, a refining center, and also a mining hub in Saudi Arabia, looping down into North Africa and right into the heart of Central Africa. Saudi Arabia sits on $1.3 trillion of mineral assets. Iran's got a lot. Afghanistan's got a lot. What are you doing with the European Union here on this front in particular, please?
I was there. I did attend the Future Minerals Forum in Riyadh a few weeks ago. And it's clear that the key word is diversification. Again, during my experience as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I experienced the COVID-19. So we discovered that there was only one supplier at world level of masks. Then, Russian aggression against Ukraine, as Europe, we discovered again that we had approximately only one supplier of gas to Europe. So the point is the diversification. And even about raw materials, it's very important to invest in this direction. I think that the countries like the GCC, as I said, in particular Saudi, they have their own mines and they are investing a lot in this sector. But in general, the GCC countries, they have strongest partnership with Asian countries and African countries that they have their own raw materials, and their own mines. So the point is that our partnership for the future about the raw materials is a need for Europe. We need that because in order to implement our Green Deal, we need more renewables, more technologies linked to renewables, so we need raw materials. So this is why we have, it's a new regulatory framework of the European Union. We published and now since January is approved the Raw Material Act, that is the new strategy of the European Union in order to create new partnerships with several countries at world level in order to create several channels of import of raw materials, of collaboration about raw materials. And I think that even the countries of the GCC, they have to be a main partner in view of this revolution where the raw materials it means renewables, Green Deal. And the last point is that sometimes there is a debate about renewables and Gulf countries. There are some people that are skeptical, that they think that it's impossible to deal about that with countries that are mainly suppliers of fossil fuels today. But if we look at the COP28 and the conclusion of the COP28, we acknowledged that working with countries like Emirates and the presidency of Emirates, we achieved the goal, the first ever goal, to have the phasing out from fossil fuels in the conclusion of a COP. This is the real challenge, to work together in order to go ahead together about the new challenges of the renewables and the Green Deal.
Okay. I want to open the floor for questions in about 3 or 4 minutes. So if you want to pose a question, I would frame it right now. I would like to ask specifically from all three panelists, what's the greatest risk right now in this energy transition? Because there's a great opportunity. I talked about this kind of global moonshot. But the greatest risk is that we don't respond to climate change, which is at our doorstep, obviously. But what's the greatest risk of us not implementing here? Do you think we can, Bill? And can we have a technology revolution that gets us there that some talk about?
We can absolutely have a technology revolution. But I think it's important. In my view, the energy transition is more than the transition between fossil fuels and green technologies. It's much more than that. It's actually the transition away from a world, and from a geopolitical sense, this is a geopolitical panel,
yes,
a world that's driven by the supply of critical materials, fossil fuels and other new materials, and moving towards where the users of electricity control their own destiny more. And that is what renewables can do to some degree, and nuclear can do to some degree. It takes the supply side out of the equation more. I hasten to say that this is not something that's going to happen very quickly. I think this is a long-term transition. And as we move towards that, and you think about it that way, the biggest obstacle will be whether countries around the world have the human capacity to enable them to take advantage of that opportunity. And when I go to countries around
to give more choice, is that what you're getting at?
To be able to take the choice and use it to their advantage. Not just be on the receiving end of a nuclear power plant or a wind turbine, but to actually be a part of, make that part of the economy, make that part of the intellectual economy. That's really going to be the challenge. So it really comes down to human capacity. So I think we need to see a generation of people who have the scientific and technical and other skills to really take advantage of these opportunities. I think that's going to be the biggest barrier, where countries have those people in the right places and at the right time.
Yeah, it's also, is to educate them on this process as well. I'm going to pose to Luigi Di Maio and to Fred another twist here. We saw during Russia-Ukraine, we had energy security trump the energy transition, because it hits people in the pocketbook, right? They were paying a lot more for the energy. So how do you get the balance right? Luigi, and then Fred?
Well, that also gets to the greatest risk. So everyone talks about the energy trilemma: security, sustainability, affordability. If you don't get all three right, it doesn't work. And we learned that with Europe. Europe had 40% of its gas from Russia, 25% of its oil, 30% of its coal. And suddenly sanctions happen and you don't have any of that any longer. And so then the question becomes affordability, because you're going to have to pay more for what you're getting from the United States. Now that resilience ended up answering the question of vulnerability. But I think the risk that I see is we go from a dependence of fossil fuel providers to a dependence on people controlling the clean energy supply cycle. So you go from one geopolitical dependence to another geopolitical dependence, and that's what concerns me.
Yeah, but China's been planning far ahead of everybody else. This is reality.
We're behind. We're behind. Everyone's behind. China. Well, China's the biggest emitter of still. And burning a lot of coal, but it's also the fastest implementer of clean technology, and obviously way ahead in electric vehicles.
Good. Luigi, I'd love to hear your thoughts on energy security and maintaining the transition. You saw the backlash in Germany in the last 2 weeks. I mean, consumers don't want to pay more for the transition. How do you see that?
I think that now we need to continue to in the direction of the diversification, because I'm repeating again this point, but I remember very well when we, after February 22 of the 2022, we experienced the point of the diversification issue. We weren't late. I use the term we discovered. We didn't discover, but in general, it was like a shock. Now the point is to continue like that, to continue with several partners about the diversification. The second point is that in any case, the gas is the energy of the transition. And I think that in a way, I don't see risks about the ecological transition if, as the CEO of the Atlantic Council, it remains a transition. If it will be a shock for companies and families, it will be a problem. So if we are able to implement a transition on the medium term, and to have on the long term the revolution of the renewables, we will be able even to make sustainable this process. Obviously, the shock of the Russian aggression against Ukraine created a lot of problems for the European families in terms of price of energy, but we know very well that now diversification on one side, transition through the gas as energy transition in view of the renewables, it's the only one way to be free. And this is why we are working a lot with the countries of the GCC, that probably they are not the main supplier of fossil fuels for Europe, but they are, of course, the future of our collaboration and partnerships about technologies for renewables, raw materials, and hydrogen, I think, because hydrogen needs stability, stable and reliable partners in order to import and to produce hydrogen abroad and to import for Europe. And I think that there are several countries that are able to create hydrogen, but we need reliable partners and stable partners. And this is not easy at world level.
No, but certainly Saudi Arabia and the UAE are sending those signals because they are going deeply into...
The Emirates too. And
the Emirates, yeah, clearly. Fred, just a quick question on the lack of creativity as government leaders. That over-dependency to Russia now in hindsight looks ridiculous, but I remember actually chairing a session with President Putin and Chancellor Merkel, and she wasn't a big fan of his, but German industry wanted that cheaper gas, and they wanted Nord Stream 2 signed. But we have options in the Eastern Mediterranean. When the crisis hit, they went to Algeria. The United States stepped in a big way with the shale gas that was shipped out. But should we do a much better job of mapping our energy supplies, whether they're fossil fuels or renewables? We just have to have a much more balanced portfolio and strategy?
We know demand is going to double by 2050. We don't know how we're going to supply that demand. And somehow in our dream world, we're going to make an energy transition without taking into account this increase of growth of demand. So you can expand and expand and expand renewables, but if the growth of demand continues, you're not going to quit using fossil fuels. So I couldn't agree more with you. It's also the reason why I think it's very short-sighted. It's my own view. I know this isn't popular with a lot of people, to rule out natural gas and LNG. It's a much cleaner outcome than coal and virtually any other fossil fuel. But there's a lot of political weight against it right now. But in the world as I know it, looking for it, I don't see how you do without it. And not to continue to invest in that would be, I think, short-sighted. Unfortunately, but I just think the transition is not a light switch, it's a rheostat, and so one has to, as you said, you have to map it out much more carefully.